Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's China Economy Lecture. We'll get started momentarily. We're just going to wait about a minute or so to give people who are logging on at the last minute a chance to get settled. Thank you for joining us.
All right. I know that people will still be trickling in, but let's be respectful of everyone's time and convene our talk. So thank you so much for joining us for the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies series on the Chinese economy. I'm Meg Withmeyer. I'm an associate professor at the Harvard Business School, where I focus on the Chinese economy. And it's my absolute pleasure to welcome today Professor Angela Zhang, who's associate professor and director of the Center for Chinese Law at the University of Hong Kong. She holds an LLB from Peking University and 3 degrees, her LLM, JD, and JSD from the University of Chicago Law School, where she worked directly with Judge Richard A. Posner, one of the American jurists that almost anyone knows by name. Angela is a specialist on a wide range of issues in law and economics in the state and business in China and beyond China. Her work has been published widely in law journals and an array of popular outlets. And we're very fortunate tonight or tomorrow morning, depending on where you're joining us, it's morning in Hong Kong, to hear about her just published book, Chinese Antitrust Exceptionalism, from Oxford University Press. The book explores the issues of antitrust in China's domestic and international competitive environment. It's a timely topic, and no one better to talk about it than Professor Zhang. So Professor Zhang will speak for about 45 minutes or so to introduce some of the ideas in the book and go beyond the book to talk about more contemporary issues. And then we'll have hopefully plenty of time for questions and answers. I remind you that you're welcome to put your question in the question box at the bottom of your screen at any point. Feel free to identify yourself if you'd like, or not. Ask a question anonymously is totally fine. And we'll look forward to hearing from Professor Zhang. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Matt, for the really generous introduction. Hello, everyone. Good evening in America, and good morning in Asia. So I prepared some slides. I would like to share my screen. Okay. So you see it okay? Yep, okay. So my book, Chinese Antitrust Exceptionalism, as you see from my background, deals with how China regulates as an antitrust regulator, as well as how China is regulated as a target for regulation. And what I say China is exceptional is because China's unique political and economic institutions, which result in strong power imbalances between businesses and the government. Now, this has implications on both how China regulates and is regulated. For instance, unlike other major antitrust jurisdictions, such as the EU or the United States, businesses rarely challenge the Chinese antitrust authority. And as a result, the entire administrative process is more or less internalized within the bureaucracy. And this makes it very important for us to understand the dynamics of the bureaucratic politics in China. Now, these power imbalances between government and businesses also make China a very unique target for regulation in foreign countries. Foreign policymakers often have a very difficult time to disentangle the relationship between business and the state. And this makes it very challenging for them to determine what exactly is the scope of the Chinese companies. Are these individual companies, or are they just part of the Greater China Inc.? So the difficulty of answering this basic question of scope makes Chinese companies very vulnerable to antitrust challenges in other countries. So in the next 30 minutes or so, I will try to give you an overview of the issues I explore in this book and also show you how this analytical framework is useful for explaining the most recent regulatory events involving Alibaba, Ant Group, and other Chinese big tech firms, and I also hope to offer you some insights into the future US-China relations. So how does China regulate? Now, just last Saturday, Alibaba received, not last Saturday, is actually April the 10th. So Alibaba received a record fine of $2.8 billion from the Chinese Antitrust Authority. Now, guess what? How Alibaba responded? They thanked the regulators. And as you see in this press release announced by the firm accepted the penalty with sincerity and will ensure its compliance with the determination. Now contrast this with Google, which has been slapped with 3 fines from the European Commission. And as you can see from the press release there, Google was prepared to fight tooth and nail with the Commission in EU court. And it is doing it right now, right? Now, Alibaba is not an exception. Now, China has been enforcing its antitrust law since 2008, and more than 12 years has passed since the law was implemented. However, so far, very few of the decisions made by the central authority has ever been challenged by businesses in court. Now, for instance, in 2015, Qualcomm, an American chip maker, received $1 billion fine in China, but they settled with the agency. Now, Tetra Pak, which was hit with a fine of almost $99 million in 2016, stated in this press release, as you see in the last sentence, "We are disappointed with the decision, but we decided to accept it and do not intend to appeal." So why are companies reluctant to challenge China's antitrust authority? Now, what makes it even more bizarre is as companies are reluctant to challenge agency decision, the overall number of administrative appeals in China is growing very rapidly. Now, this is largely because in 2014, China amended its administrative litigation law, making it significantly easier for plaintiffs to sue the government. So here you see from the Economist report on this slide, you see a significant surge in court cases. Now, so if the judiciary is improving, then why haven't we seen more plaintiffs challenging enforcement in court? Now, for those of you who understand China very well, I mean, this is a Fairbanks Center, so you have a lot of experts here will know, businesses know that generally they need to maintain a very good relationship with the government, and especially if they need to repeatedly interact with the government, right? I mean, so if you challenge the agency in court, you're essentially burning bridges with the government. Now, but what you might not know is that the Chinese Antitrust Authority, not just the Antitrust Authority, I would say other law enforcement authorities as well, are very adept at using media strategies to entice firms to cooperate and settle, and what I call strategic shaming strategy. I want to emphasize on the point of strategic, because they don't apply this sanction uniformly to all firms. They only apply it strategically. Now, let me give you an example. In 2013, the National Development Reform Commission, the NDRC, one of the China's 3 former antitrust agencies, announced on China state television that they had been investigating Bilstein and several other infant formula manufacturers for antitrust violation. Now, the next day, the People's Daily, which is the party's mouthpiece, revealed the name of a few more companies that were involved. Now, curiously, Meiji, Bainame, and Fonterra, these 3 companies, which were subject to investigation at the time, but they were omitted in both the CCTV or the People's Daily News. Now, so you see that the NDRC, in this one single case, selectively exposed these firms to 3 different levels of media publicity. And generally speaking, the less cooperative a firm is, the more it is exposed negatively in the media. Now, Bilstein, which is actually a Chinese company based in Hong Kong, was subject to the most negative media exposure because it initially tried to launch a vigorous defense. And as a result, this firm lost over 1/3 of its market capitalization within 1 week. Now, at the end, the Bilstein also received a very hefty fine, but the market capitalization loss was much, much higher than the fine that they ultimately had to pay. Now, on the other hand, other infant formula firms that were proactive in settling with the government were rewarded with very generous leniency. Now, for instance, here I show you Wire's executive, one of the infant formula producers, executive, even went on the dialogue TV show with a team of NDIC officials stating that it had quickly cooperated with the agency to provide all the documents the NDIC requested and immediately rectifies wrongdoing by reducing prices. This company ultimately received no penalty from the agency. Now, this tactic was very effective from the NDIC standpoint because the agency was very resource restrained. At that time, they had only about 25 people in Beijing. So they really cannot afford a very drawn out court battle, right? I mean, so and this method allows the agency, they don't need to spend resources in defending the case or fighting it in court. So it quickly allowed the agency to establish itself as a very forceful and serious regulator. Now, as you know, Alibaba was subject to a record fine on April the 10th. Now, what was more damaging to Alibaba is actually not the fine. It is what I call the strategic shaming sanction that was inflicted on the firm. So on Christmas Eve, if you recall, last year, the Chinese antitrust regulator posted a very short, only one sentence announcement that it had been investigating Alibaba's choose one from two business practice, okay? And then only 10 minutes later, the People's Daily published a very long commentary endorsing the investigation. So this move was probably prepared in advance because it seems designed, this commentary seems to be designed to seek first mover advantage and to shape the rhetoric of the discussion of this case. Now, as you may recall, this one sentence announcement caused Alibaba's stock prices to tumble. And on that day, Alibaba's stock dropped by more than 13% in a single day, wiping out over 100 billion US dollars of market capitalization, okay? So compare with that 2.8 billion, that was really nothing. Now, there is nothing wrong with, particularly wrong with government agency announcing the investigation on its website, right? But we should also be aware that this is the first time the SAMR, the Antitrust Authority, has ever done that, because in the past, it has always kept a very low profile in investigating cases precisely for fear of damaging company stock prices. Now, I should also note the timing of the announcement was strategically planned in advance because it was the Christmas Eve, so the long holiday break will allow the agency the room to moderate the market reaction if the announcement turned out to be too harsh. So this need for moderation might explain why the agency released this positive news on the Sunday before the next trading day, which is December the 27th, stating that it had completed evidence gathering, and then the firm was very cooperative during the process. Okay. Now, some of you may be thinking, if the authority is already challenging court, then they should be free to do whatever they want. I mean, that's actually not true. Much to the contrary, Chinese officials are subject to very severe bureaucratic constraints. Now, as one official once told me, we can only dance within the boundaries of our prescribed stage. Now, what he was talking about was referring to this phenomenon of power fragmentation in the Chinese bureaucracy, which impose significant constraints on any agency's freedom of action. So because each government department in China have their own responsibilities and objectives that define their act of action. But at the same time, they also have overlapping responsibilities. So this kind of turf war and interagency rivalries are very common. And that's what I call this Chinese styles of checks and balance. Now, Chinese antitrust enforcement is actually a prime example of this. Now, in the first decade of the antitrust enforcement, the power to enforce the law was split among three different agencies. You have the NDIC, which we already talked about, and then the SAIC. These two agencies were jointly in charge of conducting investigation. Now, you also have the Minister of Commerce, we call MOFCOM, was in charge of merger enforcement. The different missions, culture, and structure of these three agencies heavily influence how they formulate the enforcement agenda, their regulatory approach, as well as the final regulatory outcome. Now, let's first take a look at the NDIC. Now, this agency used to be the State Planning Commission and was very powerful when the Chinese economy was still centrally planned. And over the years, the NDIC has seen its power decline as market reforms deepen. So the NDIC saw antitrust enforcement as a golden opportunity to step back into the policy limelight and to fulfill its original mission of price control and ensuring stability. Now, in many cases investigated by NDIC, you saw companies actually volunteer to reduce prices. Now, from an antitrust standpoint, we think it's like really unusual for companies to do that. But we also have to understand this move, these extra legal remedies offered by these companies were precisely designed to please the regulator, right? I mean, because reducing prices is perfectly consistent with the NDIC's original mission of price control and, stabilizing prices. Now, I should say that in the Qualcomm case, you see that at the bottom, the firm offer a 35% reduction in the royalty that they would charge for the Chinese licensees. But that very important remedy, arguably the most important remedy, but was not included in the NDIC's ultimate decision. Right. So this deal, this royalty reduction deal was agreed upon behind the scenes. Now, understanding the culture of an organization is also very important to understand its behavior. The NDIC used to be the planning commission and to this day remain a very important player in macroeconomic management and industrial planning. And that's why people call it the Little State Council. It is not really a law enforcement agency, and it has like almost 1,000 staff, but very few of its members possess law degrees. So you can say, this law enforcement is not really in the DNA of this ministry. Thus, it's not surprising during antitrust investigation, the NDIC continued to employ this old tactic of holding interviews with companies. And some of these interviews were so controversial, they led to accusations of administrative power abuse and violations of due process. That probably also sowed the seeds for the complaints from corporate America, which ultimately led to the trade war, a few years later. Now, in 2018, the three former antitrust agencies were consolidated into a new bureau, which was absorbed by the SAIC to form a new ministry called the SAMR. Now, because the SAIC had been a market regulator with decades of experience in law enforcement, I saw this as a very promising step for professionalizing Chinese antitrust enforcement. And indeed, since 2018, we have seen the new Antitrust Bureau inject more transparency into its process and streamline the merger review procedures. And there have been less complaints, a few complaints from businesses about due process violations. And this is good news. But it doesn't mean that the SAMR wouldn't use antitrust law to achieve broader policy objectives. Now, some of you may have read in the news that the SAMR and a few other regulators recently held administrative guidance meeting with major Chinese tech firms after the Alibaba fine. Now, at the meeting, a large number of firms, as reported by Wall Street Journal, offered to ratify their conduct, such as the choose one from two policy that Alibaba was investigated for. And interestingly, now, these firms' offer was so broad, they went far beyond antitrust law. As I show you here, this compliance letter from JD, which emphasized its adherence to a long list of law, consumer protection law, e-commerce law, anti-monopoly law, advertising law, price law, all of this are within the enforcement mandates of the SAMR. So it appears to me that the SAMR is leveraging its antitrust function to strengthen its enforcement in many other areas of market regulation. So this development, this very new development reinforced my point about how the mission, culture, and structure of an enforcement agency really matters for an enforcement outcome. Now, I want to shift my focus to the international arena and explain how China weaponized antitrust in the Sino-US tech war. We should start by noting that the US executive branch has wide discretion in prosecuting foreign businesses and individuals. and has strategically used its legal discretion as an instrument of trade and foreign policy against China. And this is quite clear in cases like Huawei and ZTE. And these cases were a sort of wake-up call for Chinese policymakers who were scrambling to decide, what kind of policy tools we can use to counter the US long-arm jurisdiction. Now, China quickly identified antitrust as an appealing weapon to use against the US. Now, this is primarily because antitrust allowed the Chinese government to exert extraterritorial jurisdiction over US businesses' practices, as long as these companies have sufficient sales to the Chinese market. Now, for instance, a large merger transaction between a US company and a European firm, which seemingly have nothing to do with China, can be held up by China's merger control. Now, Qualcomm's acquisition of NXP in 2018 was one such example. The deal obtained clearance from 8 jurisdictions, and China was the only one that held up this deal. Now, China didn't block this deal. It just strategically delayed approval to such an extent that the parties eventually withdrew the transaction. Now, as you see recently in Wall Street Journal, Cisco's acquisition of Acacia was similarly delayed for a really long time, even though this deal was ultimately clear, but Cisco needed to pay a much higher price for the delay. And just last month, Applied Materials, which is top US chip supplier, have to walk away from its proposed deal to acquire a Japanese electric company again because of the Chinese approval delay. Now, in addition to holding up large mergers, the Chinese antitrust agency has also flagged this antitrust as a weapon to investigate foreign firms, as you see in this news article from Global Times. So it was saying that, China can investigate companies like Qualcomm, Cisco, and Apple under, laws like cybersecurity review law and anti-monopoly law. And so as Sino-US tensions increase, Chinese antitrust may become like a battleground for trade and national security issues. Now let's examine how China itself is regulated by foreign antitrust authorities. Now, China is not only unique as a regulator, but also as a target for regulation. We will start by looking at the antitrust challenges Chinese companies face in Europe. Now, after 2008, Europe saw a very large influx of capital from China. The vast majority of this investment were made by the Chinese state-owned firms. And this gave the European Commission a very big headache. Are these companies separate entities, or are they just part of a bigger China Inc. led by the Chinese government? For those of you who understand this area of literature, there's not really a black or white answer to this question, and this usual regulatory emphasis on ownership and control can actually produce misleading results. Now, in 2016, a French state-owned firm and a Chinese nuclear power company, was EDF and CGN, wanted to create a joint venture in the picture here in Hinkley Point in the UK. They run into a very big problem because the European Commission decided for the first time that it will actually treat all Chinese firms in the energy sector as one single firm for purpose of antitrust analysis. And this had huge ramification for EU law. But ironically, it also puts the Commission at risk of jeopardizing its own jurisdiction over mergers between Chinese firms or export cartels between Chinese firms, right? Because if these companies are just part of China Inc., then the Commission should have no authority over those cases because these would be deals made internally within a company. Now, this explains why the EU is increasingly looking for alternative regulatory tools in dealing with Chinese investment. And its most ambitious proposal came last year when the Commission released a white paper proposing a new merger control regime to vet state-backed acquisitions. And many observers believe that this move is precisely targeted at Chinese firms. Now, even when Chinese firms are facing regulatory trouble in Europe, they are also facing challenges in the United States. And it's well known that China's increasing trade dominance have stoked anxiety among US politicians. And that was one of the reasons why the Trump administration imposed very high tariffs on Chinese steel at the beginning of this trade war. And the fears of Chinese dominance were further elevated during COVID as Americans realized how much they depend on China for PPE supplies. And in fact, America now imports 97% of its antibiotics and 90% of its vitamin C from China. Now, at the same time, China's dominance in those essential component markets have been conducive to the formation of export cartels. And in the past 2 decades, many Chinese manufacturers have been hit with antitrust litigation in the United States precisely for conducting export cartels. Now, the most famous case involved a group of vitamin C producers from China, and this case went all the way up to the US Supreme Court. Now, these producers did not deny that they have coordinated prices, but they defended themselves on the basis that it was the Chinese government that asked them to fix prices. The Ministry of Commerce from China also acknowledged by submitting an amicus brief in a very unprecedented move, acknowledging that it had indeed compelled these firms to organize an export cartel to avoid anti-dumping challenges. And in the end, the Supreme Court decided that it was not bound by the interpretation by the Ministry of Commerce, and instead deferred to the US branch in deciding how to handle this case. So this makes the Chinese exporters in a catch-22 situation because of the abundant supply in China, and so there's an oversupply in many areas, right? So if they compete fiercely, inevitably they would drive the prices so low, and then they could be subject to anti-dumping charges. Now, on the other hand, if they coordinate in advance and raise prices, then they might be violating US antitrust law, right? So the situation puts the Chinese exporters in a very precarious position. Finally, I'd like to offer some of the book's insight on US-China relations, Chinese regulation, the big tech, as well as data regulation. Now, for a really long time, people ask this question, is China a friend or a foe? Now, more and more of you may decide that China is no longer a friend, but the reality remains that the Chinese and the US economies are tightly integrated, and there are mutual benefits for cooperation at both sides, right? In many areas, including climate, right? It's a hot topic recently. So the question becomes, in the absence of friendship and trust, is there any hope for cooperation? Now, I hope this book tells you yes, right? I mean, you see, although foreign firms are vulnerable to regulatory attacks from Chinese authorities, Chinese firms are equally vulnerable to attacks from foreign regulators. And we are seeing tightening scrutiny over Chinese firms from both the EU and the US regulators. So the fact that both sides can obtain significant leverage over the other is actually a good thing, because this is a kind of hostage exchange situation that is essential to maintaining peace between the two countries. And that's precisely why I think more integration rather than less is helpful for peace. Now, for instance, if more Chinese companies are blocked from the US market, like what TikTok, WeChat, or Huawei have experienced, then the United States will have less leverage over China. And that actually makes the US operation in China, think about Qualcomm, think about Tesla, right, more vulnerable. This company will become more vulnerable in China. Now, let's also take a look at the book's insight on Chinese fintech regulation. So in the past couple of months, a regulatory storm has blown into China's tech sector, right? Ant Group's IPO, which is supposedly the largest IPO ever, was suspended just 48 hours before its launch. Now, many of the major themes in this book, which we just talked about, are incredibly helpful in explaining what is going on with Chinese regulation of big tech. And we all know that Jack Ma's speech was a very important trigger. But given all this regulatory concern that people have, particularly the regulator have over Ant, why did Ant get the green light to launch its IPO in the first place? So in this op-ed I published in Project Syndicate recently, I argue this has to do with power fragmentation in the Chinese bureaucracy, which is a point I consistently highlight in this book. So Chinese fintech companies like Ant, they are very good at seeking regulatory arbitrage. And by taking advantage of these conflicting goals and missions of different agencies, as we talk about, right? So the People's Bank of China, which oversees prudential regulation, has been a very persistent regulator and has kept a very close eye on Ant from the very start. Now, other financial regulators like the China Securities Regulatory Commission, the CSRC, have very different agenda. The CSRC actually expedited its IPO because it saw it as an important boost to the domestic securities market, particularly when many Chinese firms have been forced to delist from the United States. So in the eyes of the CSRC, this successful launch of Ant's IPO would have been a piece of national pride to the US sanctions. So again, you see different agencies have different incentive in regulating businesses based on their different missions and objectives. Now, this analytical framework in the book is also helpful for analyzing other areas of regulation. And just to give you an example here, data, because it's a very hot topic these days. Now, similar to antitrust, bureaucratic politics also dominates the administrative enforcement process of data protection law. And in China, there are currently at least 4 regulators in charge of legislation and enforcement, and there are other industry regulators that could be involved as well. Now, similarly, the degree of power that the government has over businesses, again, we go back to the first slide about the power imbalances between businesses and government, also leads to very deep foreign mistrust of foreign firms when it comes to data security, right? I mean, that's precisely the reason why firms like TikTok or WeChat have experienced many difficulties as they expand in other countries like the United States, precisely because of data protection issues. And I would like to pause there, and thanks very much. And I really look forward to discussing this book with Matt and the audience here. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Angela. That was a tremendous amount of insight, and I have a lot of questions myself. We're opening it up to Q&A, so please do type your question in the Q&A box. We already have a couple, but I'm going to take my privilege and ask my question first. And so the first has to do with whether you have observed the articulation of a theory of antitrust in China along the lines that, you know, we see these kinds of intellectual debates in the United States and Europe over time, and regulators in those two markets have different authorities in antitrust. And so if you've seen the emergence of any consistent principles or debates on antitrust within the Chinese market. And then secondly, which, you know, someone's asked about the application of China's anti-monopoly law to SOEs in China. And so whether there's any consideration of using, you know, as you talk about power fragmentation, you know, using certain parts of the Chinese bureaucracy to try to discipline SOEs at you know, within different parts of the Chinese fragmented bureaucracy. So, so those were sort of my two questions, and one from the audience so far.
Thank you very much. But well, I mean, these are very interesting questions. So first of all, regarding whether there have been any consensus as to how to regulate big tech in China, you know, the scope of the public discussion is limited due to censorship, and obviously the government controls the media, right? I mean, so what we see from most media outlets, you see more or less a consensus of what to do, which is driven down from Beijing, a top-down initiative. And what is particularly unique about this round of the Chinese antitrust enforcement is, unlike before, where it's mostly a kind of like a bottom-up process, this time is really driven from a top-down initiative. So this is like part of what we are seeing now is part of a larger law enforcement campaign against these companies. So all the rhetoric have been closely shaped. As you see, you know, as soon as Alibaba was investigation was announced, there was 10 minutes later, there was a People Daily, you know, commentary, you know, put in there just to shape the rhetoric, because they know other media outlets will quote, and this commentary will also guide, you know, other media outlets, including those commercial media outlets as well, right? I mean, so we, at least on the surface, you sort of see a consensus of what we need to do, and everybody applaud the government's action. But underneath, I believe there must be different opinions, you know, that we don't see in the public discussion, right? And then obviously the big tech companies themselves have very effective lobbying. They have been preparing for this day for a really long time. And they have done tremendous lobbying, I suspect, behind the scenes as well. As you see earlier, in early November last year, when the agency released a draft guidelines on online platform, and then compare that version of the guidelines with the version that was finally published in February this year, there was a lot of changes, and all these changes were quite positive and favorable for big tech. They remove a lot of controversial provisions. Supposedly will make it easier for regulator to find dominance, determine dominance, and supposedly will make the possession of data more likely to lead to dominance. They remove all these controversial provisions, right? So there must be a lot of things happening behind the scene, and there could be internal disagreement as to how we deal with these companies, right? And even if you stay, even you stay from the standpoint of those regulators, I think they are also confronted with competing policy goals here. On the one hand, you do want to foster innovation, and because these are the national champions, right? If you think about techno-nationalism, it doesn't seem to make any sense for China to crack down its own tech firms. But on the other hand, authoritarian government also have agenda and policy to preserve social stability, right? If because the concentration of the market has led to a lot of antitrust issues, not just antitrust, but also social problems like inequality, employment, labor, a lot of issues, right? So there is also other policy objectives the government needs to consider. So they are, internally, I'm sure the government needs to balance these two competing goals. And that's precisely why I believe, the big tech has been very effective in the lobbying. And it can also be reflected in the recent move by the antitrust regulator. Because as soon as you see after Alibaba was fine, the market was panicked, who will be next? Would it be Meituan? Would it be Tencent? Right? Everybody's calling me. It's like, yeah, just tell me who's next. And I said, I was just reiterate those points I just talked about. The government has many policy consideration here. So it's not surprising because you see a few days later, the SAMR announced that we're going to have this conference meeting with all these big tech firms. And if they rectify their behavior, submit all these rectification plans, and you make this commitment in advance in public, and it seems like they're not going to investigate them, right? So the agency is simultaneously extending both a promise and a threat here. If you comply, then there's no more investigation, and that, calm the investors, tame the market, as you see how much Tencent and the Meituan stock has plummeted in the past couple of months, right? Because of Alibaba, because people are afraid the spillover effects into their companies. So this tame the market, assure the investors. But on the other hand, they still want to maintain a threat, right? If you don't behave, I can come back to investigate you anytime. I can come back to investigate your past exclusionary practice as well. They have perfectly legitimate reason to do that. So you see, this is a very Chinese style of governance, and it also reflects this kind of multi-agenda on the government's plates. Yeah. And regard to the second question about SOE, I'm actually there is a perfect example in this in China's antitrust enforcement. In 2011, the NDRC, which is the former antitrust regulator, they investigated China Telecom and China Unicorn, two of the largest state-owned telecom firms, for abuse of dominance. And that case was also strategically announced on the Chinese state media. It was actually announced on state television, similar to the Bilstein case that we talk about. And actually, these are the only two times in the past 12 years that I ever seen the antitrust authority announce this case on state media. And this move was precisely to gain momentum to push forward this case, because that case, they run into a lot of trouble. Bureaucratic resistance we already talked about in the paper, right? In the book, they're not challenged in court, but they face with a lot of bureaucratic constraints when they particularly go after large state-owned firms, because these state-owned firms themselves have bureaucratic rank. Their rank is actually higher than the Antitrust Bureau had, right? I mean, they didn't take them seriously at the beginning at that time, 2011. There's only 3 years when the antitrust law was implemented, right? I mean, so they didn't take the authority seriously, even when the authority go and investigate them. And they also have a lot of backers behind them, because the state-owned firm can more easily leverage and lobby within the government, right? I mean, they have the they have the sector regulator, the MIIT, the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, which is a sector regulator overseeing telecom pricing. So the sector regulators were very upset with NDRC investigation, because NDRC also have some policy control over telecom pricing. So it see this antitrust investigation as a move of the agency to trying to expand and its turf and encroach upon MIIT's territory. So MIIT very fiercely objected to this. And then there is also the SASAC, like the state assets watchdog, which concern, if you bring this kind of cases, it's going to have strong repercussion to the firm's stock prices. It will lead to, state assets loss. And that was precisely what happened, right? I mean, the NDRC, when it announced on the state television, it caused these two firms' stock, plummet dramatically on that day, because it sent a very bad signal to the market. It was like, is this firm, falling out of favor with the government? I mean, why is the government using Chinese antitrust law to deal with its own state-owned firm, right? So you imagine all this bureaucratic existence gave NDRC a very big headache at that time, and that's precisely why it used media to try to push forward this case. And eventually, this case resulted in kind of like a compromise. So these two firms offer remedies to kind of address some of this concern. It also partly also expand NDRC's turf in a sense, because if you look at the final remedies they offer, they actually have, not just have to address the antitrust issues, but to expand NDRC's control over telecom pricing. But at the same time, NDRC did not fine these companies. So the case was suspended. There was no penalty. That's just ended. So I see it as a compromise behind the scene among these different, bureaucratic interests. But that's a perfect example of power fragmentation in China. Yeah.
Yes, it is a perfect example. It's a fascinating case. So I'm going to ask a question from Bill Xiao, my colleague at the Fairbanks Center, who asked a similar question about the different standards and criteria for monopoly and antitrust in the U.S. versus China. And so in terms of, for example, looking at, if I can kind of add in a little bit to his question. So, in the United States for such a long time, it's been about price, right? It's been about price as the determinant of abuse of market position or monopoly. And in China, clearly, it's not just price, it's something else. And so is there a consistent way of thinking about those standards in China, and how would you compare it to the U.S.?
Well, I mean, Chinese authorities are very much up to date. I mean, they follow whatever the U.S., the EU was talking about very closely. If you talk to the people on the ground, I mean, they're totally on top of everything, every single law, every debate that was happening in other jurisdictions. So at the academic level or even at the agency level, I think they're well versed of what's happening right now. I mean, there is a bigger debate in the U.S. right now, whether we've from the traditional emphasis on price to maybe broader objective about quality, about innovations, right? I mean, but in China, I think our authority needs to take into account much more, consideration than just price, innovations, and quality. And obviously, these will be important priority considerations. But I think they need to consider more. Right. I mean, as you see recently in this in Wall Street Journal, there's been a lot of rumors, from the media. Right. I mean, for instance, Alibaba is asked to divest media assets. There's been rumor. I mean, obviously, at the end, you see the penalty decision. There's no divestiture of any sort. And by the way, under Chinese law, there's not really a legal basis for the authority to ask the firm to divest its assets on the basis of abuse of dominance anyway. So at the time when I saw the Wall Street Journal paper, I was quite puzzled. I mean, where does this come from? But at least, it has to come from somewhere within the bureaucracy. Somebody at the bureaucracy have proposed, we just feel uncomfortable. This firm has grown so big and, and has the power to control public opinion, right? I mean, there have been instances where it seems like the firm has manipulated some of the public opinion involving the scandal of its executive, and that worry the government, right? I mean, to control the public opinion was something that they worry about. I mean, that, but as to how the government deal with those issues, they could use antitrust to solve this problem potentially. I mean, because it is, if they bought in, Weibo, they bought in South China Morning Post, they could unwind this transaction, although it's not a very strong legal basis. But at the same time, as I talk about in this talk, sometimes firms offer extra legal remedies to please the regulator, right? I mean, there's nothing wrong for the firm to just volunteer, right? I mean, even if the government doesn't say it in the decision, right? I mean, so you see in the Qualcomm decision, right? The most important remedy was not incorporated in the legal decision. It was bargained behind the scenes, right? I mean, so I would not be surprised if the firm divests some part of the assets that the government doesn't like, even if it's not theoretically under the law, right? I mean, and it's to address some of the concern of the government over these big tech firms. Yeah.
So related to that, there's an excellent question from Lei Sun, which is taking all of this into consideration. Do you feel that China's antitrust enforcement and practice is strengthening the rule of law or weakening it? So, and there's evidence on both sides. And what do you think?
It's a very complicated question. I mean, as a law professor, what I see is particularly promising is the agency restructurings that happened in 2018, which consolidated all the enforcement power under the SAMR, which is the new ministry, because this is traditionally a market regulator have decades of experience in law enforcement. So naturally, you will expect this agency will know what it's doing, unlike before when we have an industrial planner and DRC to enforce this law, right? And these agencies go out to talk to merchants and force them to low prices. I mean, that's not how it's supposed to be done. So I do see some positive sign with Chinese antitrust enforcement, particularly with this restructuring, this change of institutional structure, which is hugely important. But that's a point that tends to be overlooked because lawyers and the public tend to look at the law itself, kind of look at the black and white letter. They didn't know, how much the institutional factors, like including the people there, the culture of the organization, the structure of the organization has such a huge impact on how it is enforced, right? I mean, but on the other hand, as you see in the recent round of the law enforcement campaign, which was very much driven by a top-down initiative, right? I mean, you see this kind of repeated use of strategic shaming. You see this kind on Alibaba, right, which caused these firms to lose how much, like 13% of market cap, and it's still not coming back. Even though its stock prices has rebounded when the penalty decision was released, it actually rebounded by up to 8% on that day, but it's still not coming back. The stock prices were still quite suppressed. But this kind of strategic reputation damage inflict on the company will have a long-lasting impact on this firm. Right. I mean, that also explains why the firm was very proactive in cooperating with the agency. Remember, back in 2015, and the Alibaba also have a public row with SAIC, which is the predecessor of the current antitrust authority, SAMR. At that time, Alibaba did, fight very fiercely in public. It complained about the agency's improper procedure of scrutinizing this counterfeit products, and they make a public row, calling the director of the e-commerce bureau, blowing the black whistle, right? I mean, although eventually that public row also caused Alibaba stock to tumble by 8% on that day, but you see at that time the firm was more more ready to fight, but here it was like completely tame, right? I mean, there's like, we thank the regulator, we're ready to move on, It's a very different dynamic. So because this strategic shaming strategy was extremely helpful. And you also see, again, this kind of administrative interviews that have been conducted with all these big tech firms, and these big tech firms volunteer to offer preemptive commitments of compliance, right? I mean, and then now there's no more, it seems like the government is making a promise that if you comply, we're not going to, go after your past practices. I mean, that doesn't seem to be on the basis of, law, right? I mean, if you have this firm has conducted exclusionary conduct that could be violating law, then it's the responsibility of the agencies to go after this company. It's like, I mean, what is the legal basis of the settlement? I mean, this is not even, something within the realm of the antitrust law. There's not it's not a legal basis for doing that. Preemptively settle, right? I mean, and also think about, along with the penalty decision that was issued on Alibaba, the SAMR imposed an administrative guidance note for Alibaba. There was a 16-point administrative guidance note that was hardly mentioned in any media coverage. But if you go to take a look at this 16 guidance note, which Alibaba is required to submit a ratification plan by the end of this month. And they also need to submit an annual report to the agency in the next 3 years. You will see this guidance note not just deal with antitrust, it deals with all sorts of compliance issues that the firm need to deal with. And all these compliance issues obviously also fall within the mandates of the antitrust authority, SAMR, which is just talked about. I mean, they're trying to leverage antitrust as the function to expand into other territories of enforcement, right? I mean, this regulatory spillover was clearly, was very explicitly indicated in this administrative guidance law. And again, administrative guidance there's no legal basis in law. Right? I mean, you can make administrative guidance according to law or not according to law, right? I mean, it's just guidance from the agency. But in the current political environment and this situation, is Alibaba going to follow this guidance? Yes, right? I mean, they are definitely going to submit this replication plan, right? I mean, they're going to submit this annual report and there will be no challenge, right? I mean, so you do see this kind of repeated dynamics, unfortunately, you see this kind of extra legal remedies that were offered. You see the extra legal measures that was applied in the current round of the law enforcement campaign.
Okay, so I'm tempted to say then, I guess then the conclusion is that there's really no rule of law in China and hardly even rule by law. So for a long time, right, the kind of theory of what legal development in China was, the development of legal foundations for the state to rule, but not to constrain itself. But now, I guess what I'm hearing is that now there's not even this idea that there should be law that forms the basis of state power, that state power is kind of exercised at will. Is that the correct conclusion, or is that too far?
I think it depends. The answer is it depends, because like as we see in the slides that I show, this Economist paper, and as well as the data disclosed by the Economist, right? I mean, you did see a significant surge administrative appeals, like appeals against the government in Chinese court in recent years, like because of the amendment of the administrative litigation law, which significantly reduced the barrier for ordinary people to file suits against government, right? But so far, just within the realm of this kind of cases between big business and the government, we haven't seen that law change. That promising change has affected that category of cases, right? I mean, so maybe for some other categories, like, ordinary citizens suing a small bureau agents, which can solve the government's agency problem. I mean, those cases may be easier, trademark disputes may be easier, but not with regard to, the biggest case between government and the businesses.
Great. So that's a good segue into a large number of questions we have basically on these big tech firms. So a lot of questions related to Jack Ma. Why did he give the speech that he gave in Shanghai? Did he miscalculate or misunderstand something about this new direction, or as you say, this new political climate? And what is next? I mean, so I know everyone's calling you to ask what is next and who is next, but what are the implications for companies like Tencent and ByteDance, given what happened? And relatedly, Minya from BU asks, is there an exit option for Alibaba? So given this, this kind of political climate you've described where antitrust will be wielded as a weapon in a larger struggle of the state versus large firms, is there any choice of like voice or exit, right? Basically for a company like Alibaba, or it's what I'm hearing from you is they just must say, they thank the regulators, ask for another fine if they need to ask for another fine and move on. But is there any potential or any space for firms like that to resist?
Right. I mean, there's a lot of questions here. So Meg, maybe I do it one by one. First question is about Jack Ma. Why did he make that speech? Right. I mean, everybody know he's like superstar business leader and have this cult-like, aroma around him. And then but at the same time, if you look around, the Chinese leading entrepreneurs, he's very much an outlier. He's very outspoken. And he liked this media engagement. I mean, if you contrast this with Pony Ma of Tencent, right? I mean, very much more low key, much more reserved, So in a sense that Ma is already an outlier among Chinese entrepreneurs. And as to why he made that particularly controversial speech in Shanghai, this really, we need to really, if you don't mind, I can tell you, we need to go back a little bit to the regulatory history of Ant Group, which is the fintech giant that Jack Ma founded back in 2016. So Ant has operated in a regulatory minefield from the start because it deals with payment business. It also do lending, insurance, investment, right? I mean, so over the years, the PBOC, the People's Bank of China, has been keeping a very close scrutiny on various business of Ant. But as we talk about in the book, right, I mean, power is fragmented within Chinese bureaucracy. So Ant, having grown up on the Chinese soil and having been led by incredibly smart leadership, right? I mean, people like Jack, knows how to maneuver this kind of bureaucratic politics really well, right? I mean, because the power fragmentation, which is the Chinese style of checks and balance, allow the company the opportunity to seek for regulatory arbitrage, right? I mean, as we said, the authoritarian government has multi-purpose policy goals, right? They want economic prosperity, they want social stability, and they want nationalism. They want the national champions as well, right? I mean, so Ant is very good at exploiting those, conflicting missions and objectives among different agencies and between different levels of government, right? I mean, Alibaba and Ant obviously have very close relationship with the local government, right? I mean, so they trying to play this game, leveraging this different levels of government and the different agencies, different objectives to play with each other. And I really see Ant as a success story because the company operate in such a difficult area, right? I mean, so have so much vested interest, but I was able to go that far, until last October, right? I mean, so, but for all this period, Ant has been in a regulatory competition. It has been in a running competition with the regulator. That's why I write in the product syndicate op-ed, right? I mean, because Jack Ma was saying, we have to run ahead of the regulator. We have to, otherwise we go nowhere, right? I mean, so they keep innovating their product, and this innovation, this financial innovation, will not, does not fall within the realm of the existing regulation, right? Because they're new, right? I mean, and and also it's not clear which regulator should have policy control over that product. And let me give an example, right? I mean, they have this called 相互保, which is a mutual aid insurance product, and claim that this is not insurance. This is a mutual aid product. People just put in their money and inside this pot, and if somebody gets sick, they can take money from here. They can claim the money, right? I mean, it's not insurance, but it does look like insurance, right? I mean, so they're very good, right? I mean, so there's always a regulatory lag between, when they create a product and when the regulator can finally catch up, right? I mean, so and if you look at it in the past 5 years, they keep innovating, they keep creating things, and whenever they launch a product, overnight it becomes a sensational story. Like the next day, it becomes the largest fund like Yueba become the largest investment fund in the world, right? Because Alipay is so huge, right? I mean, so they can create a scale very quickly. and they can innovate very quickly. So the regulator was always like running behind the company. And even when Ant was going to file the IPO. Now go back to when we already talked about why they can get the green light to get the IPO, because they take advantage of this intense relationship between the United States and China. They want to use this as an example to boost China's domestic stock market, right? I mean, but even if after they file, the PBOC was still running, right? The PBOC was still trying to rein in Ant. Particularly, they're worried about this the lending business, because in the IPO prospectus, they saw, like the vast majority of Ant's revenue derived from the lending business and from the microloan lending business. But Ant has no skin in the game in those businesses, because 98% of the loans were extended by the state banks, right? I mean, so right now, if you look at Ant's balance sheet, it's perfect, right? There's no default, and the default rate is very low. I mean, balance sheet looks perfect, right? Right now, it all looks fine, but there's a hidden risk, right? I mean, because that business model could potentially lead to moral hazard, which is the point, American audience is very familiar with the back in 2008 subprime mortgage crisis, right? So the PBOC has perfectly legitimate concern over Ant, and even Ant had to file for IPO, the PBOC continued to press ahead with a lot of regulatory rules, including, you see back in September, the PBOC issued draft rules that indicate it will regulate Ant as a financial holding company. But during Ant's IPO roadshow, Ant very aggressively promote itself as a tech firm. And that led to a direct conflict between the regulator and Ant, right? I mean, because having a tech firm's valuation is much, much higher than have the valuation much higher than a financial company. And so, and that's why, I guess behind the scenes, the regulator has been pushing to push forward that draft rules to regulate Ant as a financial holding company, as you see now, what's happening now, right? And that will have an effect on Ant's stock prices. But at that point, when Ma made the speech, they have just got the valuation already. And that was huge, right? I mean, over 300 billion US dollars, right? I mean, so you can see the tension is always there. And it's not surprising that Ma was always was not happy with the financial regulation. And maybe that's the reason why he want to voice this discontent in this very high profile event. But obviously, it also gave an opening for this regulator to bring in Jack Ma. Yeah. So the second question on Tencent, what's going to happen with Tencent and firms like ByteDance? Well, I mean, that goes back to the point of, the different policy objectives of the government, right? I mean, companies like Tencent, ByteDance are national prize of the government. It's never in Chinese government's interest to, sabotage these companies or undermine these companies, right? I mean, these companies will be tremendously important for China's economic growth, and also to fulfill China's China's ambition as like a high-tech leader, like this kind of supremacy in technology. And think about, I see this kind of crackdown. I actually wrote another small piece. I see that what can really result from this crackdown is like these companies will be nudged towards a different direction. Because if you look at United States and China, look at their big tech businesses. China is the only one that can foster tech giants like the United States right now. But our tech firms, when we're talking about Alibaba, Tencent, ByteDance, this household name, they did not thrive because of cutting-edge innovations like Huawei. They thrive because they are able to cater to the vast consumer market. We are very good with mobile payments, fintech, and online communication and e-commerce, right? I mean, but these are not, truly innovative, like technology, and not those that China desperately needs right now. Instead, you see these tech firms like Tencent investing in community group buying, which is squeezing the interest of the small and medium-sized, grocery stores, right? I mean, this is not, if you stand in the shoes of the government, this is not the kind of competition that we want. What the Chinese leadership want, which is the biggest elephant in the room, is that how do we close the gap in this technological rivalry with the United States, right? I mean, we need more companies like Huawei. We need more companies that, the Chinese government think we need companies that really are truly innovative, that invest in foundational science and technology, right, to close this gap. And so, and if they look around, really, they can really count on these people, because these firms, because they're cash rich, right? I mean, they have tons of money. They have an army of talents. They are very sophisticated in software development already. So it's very natural for the government to count on this firm to move towards those directions. And that kind of intention is quite clear. As you see, recently there was a People's Daily commentary saying, don't just focus on selling cabbage. Focus on looking at the stars, right? I mean, aim, have bigger ambitions, and I think the government will have stronger urge to push this company towards that direction, because the antitrust does give the government a leverage, right? I mean, because these are not state-owned firms. For the government to discipline these companies, antitrust is an incredibly useful tool, and that tool is already overhanging this company's head, right? Because you're so successful. Right? I mean, that your biggest vulnerability will be antitrust, and the government can always go after you using antitrust. But of course, if you're going to become Huawei, I mean, we're not going to use antitrust law over Huawei, right? I mean, so I think these firms will strive to become more innovative in the direction the government desire as a form of self-protection. But as to how efficient would that be, that's another question, right? But you already see the company doing that, right? I mean, Tencent have invested hundreds of billions of dollars in digital infrastructure. Alibaba have invested in semiconductor, and Baidu has invested heavily on driverless car. And I think in the next few years, you should expect these companies to do more in those areas. Yeah. Okay.
Well, we'll take, last question. I think this is, you're putting together just an amazing amount of information, and we're grateful to you, but we realize we're probably taxing you quite a bit. So the very last question is a very sort of antitrust question, and it's about price fixing and who's adjudicating it. So the question is that vertical price fixing, as opposed to horizontal, has been the subject of policy debate in the U.S., with more conservatives kind of arguing that vertical price fixing should not be subject to anti-monopoly regulation. In China, there doesn't appear to be any sympathy with that viewpoint. And does that sound right to you?
Oh, yeah. Our regulators love vertical price fixing. we love it. They love it in a sense that because these are the cases very easy to go after. Mm-hmm. And to this day, during the days of the NDRC, I mean, the NDRC just like completely prioritized on doing these RPM cases, precisely because, unlike cartels, which is very secretive, it's very difficult to gather evidence. RPM is, you more or less have some complaints, it's much easier to identify the evidence. And unlike abuse, which takes, exhausting amount of time to do the investigation and also do the market analysis, RPM, when you find it, you see it, right? I mean, so they supposedly show a much lower burden of proof in investigating those cases, and actually form the major component of the enforcement efforts for the first decade of the enforcement. And to this day, you continue to see they continuously bring these cases in RPM. It's now, as to how much it benefits consumer, that's another story, because in those cases, you always see, as soon as the regulator bring in, they raise their hands, and then they offer to reduce prices. But how long they reduce the price, that's another question, how long that will last. And those cases were rarely challenged in court. It just gives a very convenient policy tool for the regulator to stabilize prices. And unfortunately, we're still seeing that direction going on these days. I think there was a question earlier about exit option of these companies. Yeah, I mean, exit options of companies like Alibaba. I don't think companies like Alibaba is going to exit. I mean, in contrast to this kind of dire consequences that have been portrayed in the Western media, right? I mean, we have to bear in mind that these Chinese companies grown up in China's unique political and economic institutions. They know how to adapt to this institutional environment very well. I mean, they have many ways that they can continue to, find a room to grow, survive, or even prosper in the Chinese economy. And so I'm quite optimistic about the resilience, right? I mean, we already talked about a very important strategy that they employ, which is regulatory arbitrage. And I think they will continue to explore that opportunity, right? I mean, not just among different agencies, but even among different areas of law, right? I mean, so you see Alibaba and Tencent have been, Ant Group and Tencent have been asked to transfer data to the government, government joint venture in order to, and that will be, will be a huge blow to their competitive advantage. But these tech firms were saying, we can't just transfer data to another firm because that would be violation of consumer privacy, right? I mean, so they're very smart, right? I mean, they're playing different laws against each other. And I would think that they will be proactively seeking for privacy regulation to regulate themselves, to strengthen and entrench their own dominant position. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, there's a famous saying that those that doesn't kill me make me stronger. And I think that they will emerge unscathed from this for a large extent, and then they might even become stronger in the future.
This has been amazing. We're lucky to have your voice in this, educating us in this incredible time. I mean, it's amazing to watch what's happening in China right now. Nobody knows more about these different agencies and what their purviews are and what their fights are than you do. So I highly recommend Angela Zhang's book, and just please join me in thanking her for giving this talk on a bright early morning in Hong Kong. We're grateful to you, and so thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Matt. It was a great pleasure to be here.
Great. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.